The train car smelled of wet coats, cold coffee, and the metallic tang of Chicago rain. Hazel Whitmore didn't notice any of it. She was too tired to notice anything. Her eyelids had been fighting gravity for the last 6 hours, and somewhere between the 47th floor of Sterling and Vance and the flickering fluorescent lights of the Red Line, her body had finally decided to surrender. She didn't know that the man whose shoulder she was about to fall asleep on was the most feared Mafia boss in the Midwest. She didn't know that his hand hovering an inch above her hair was trembling for the first time in 7 years. She didn't know that a single scarf, a single rainstorm, and a single whispered prayer had already tied her life to his long before she ever boarded that train. But before the night was over, an empire would tilt on its axis. A cruel woman in Louboutin heels would learn what real power sounds like when it whispers. And a girl who had spent her entire adult life believing she was invisible would discover that someone had been searching for her face in every crowd for 7 long years. If you love stories where the quiet ones finally get their crown, hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what happens next is going to break your heart in the best possible way. Hazel Whitmore was 26 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and carried her weight the way most women carried their groceries, apologetically. She had soft brown eyes that had learned very early in life not to ask the world for anything, chestnut hair perpetually twisted into a messy bun at the nape of her neck, and a covey figure that her cleaning uniform had never quite forgiven her for. The polyester stretched a little too tight across her shoulders and hips, and every time she bent to scrub a toilet on the executive floor of Sterling and Vance, she could feel the seams protest. She worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., cleaning the offices of lawyers who billed more per hour than she made in a month. And then on weekends, she caught the bus out to St. Anne's Hospice in Cicero, where she bathed and fed dying strangers for $11 an hour because the tips were nothing, but the gratitude was everything. In her apron pocket, she always carried a small spiral notebook, the kind you buy for 99 cents at Walgreens, and on its first page, written in careful looping handwriting, were the words that governed her entire existence. Grandma Nora, 6 a.m., blood pressure medication, use the blue cup. Grandma Nora, noon, second pill, no grapefruit juice. Emma's grave, first Sunday of the month, bring the yellow tulips. Emma had been 14 when leukemia took her, and Hazel had been 19. Their mother had disappeared into a bottle 2 years before that, and their father had been a rumor even before Emma was born. So at 19, Hazel had inherited a dying sister, a grandmother whose memory was already beginning to slip, and a mountain of medical debt that she was still, 7 years later, chipping away at $14 an hour at a time. She had been 3 semesters into a nursing degree at Loyola when Emma got sick. She had dropped out the same week the diagnosis came. She had never gone back. Nursing school was for girls who had time. Hazel had bills. Her manager at Sterling and Vance, a nervous little man named Gerald, only kept her on because Hazel remembered everything. She remembered which senior partner was allergic to lavender air freshener, which paralegal cried in the third-floor bathroom every Thursday and always needed the tissue box refilled by Friday morning, and which conference room hosted the confidential meetings where the trash had to be shredded, not bagged. She was invisible in the way only useful people are allowed to be invisible, which is to say, until the moment someone decided she wasn't useful anymore. That someone was Camille Ashford. Camille was 32, a junior partner at Sterling and Vance, engaged to the eldest son of a sitting United States senator, and possessed of the kind of ice-blue eyes that had never once been softened by an unmet need. She wore her platinum hair in a razor-sharp bob, her heels red-soled and 4 inches tall, and her cruelty polite. She was the kind of woman who could destroy your career while complimenting your earrings. On the Tuesday night that changed everything, Camille was still at her desk at 11:47 p.m., pretending to work, when Hazel wheeled her cleaning cart onto the 47th floor. Camille had waited for her. She had, in fact, spilled an entire Veni oat milk latte across her own mahogany desk 5 minutes earlier, watching the liquid pool over a stack of contracts she had already photocopied, just so she would have an audience. "Oh, good," Camille said without looking up as Hazel appeared in the doorway. "The help is here." Hazel didn't respond. She had learned a long time ago that women, like Camille, didn't want responses. They wanted reactions, and reactions were currency Hazel refused to spend. She set down her cart, pulled on her gloves, and began to blot the desk with paper towels. Camille leaned back in her ergonomic chair, crossed her long thin legs, and picked up her phone. She dialed her friend on speaker, loud enough that Hazel couldn't pretend not to hear. "You will not believe what they let clean this firm," Camille drawled into the receiver. "I swear to God, Jessica. The girl's uniform looks like it's about to file for a restraining order. I don't know how HR sleeps at night." The voice on the other end laughed. Hazel kept scrubbing. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, and she kept scrubbing. When she finished, she straightened, and out of pure habit, because her hands could not leave a room in disorder, she reached over and gently corrected the frame of a small photograph on Camille's desk that had gone slightly crooked. It was a picture of Camille with her fiancé at some yacht club in Newport. Hazel didn't look at it. She just straightened it because straightening things was what she did. Then she wheeled her card out. She did not know that Camille had been recording the entire exchange on her phone. She did not know that Camille had already decided, in the way spoiled women sometimes decide these things over lukewarm lattes, that Hazel Whitmore was going to be fired by morning. By 2:14 a.m., Hazel was standing on the rain-slick platform at Lake and State, waiting for the last southbound red line of the night. Her phone buzzed. It was Marta, the neighbor who sat with Grandma Nora on the overnight shifts Hazel worked. Marta's text was short. "She's asking for Emma again. She keeps calling me Emma. Please come home." Hazel pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them, the train was pulling in. She stepped inside the nearly empty car, dropped into a seat near the middle, and let her canvas bag slide off her shoulder onto the floor between her feet. She had been awake for 21 hours. Her eyes were burning. She told herself she would just rest her head for one stop. Just one. At the next station, 3 men in dark suits boarded the car in a formation so precise it looked choreographed. They did not sit. They positioned themselves. One at the front door, one at the rear, and one leaning casually against a pole with his eyes scanning the platform outside. And behind them, unhurried, boarded a 4th man. He was tall, 6'2" at least, with jet black hair swept back from a widow's peak, a jaw carved from something colder than granite, and eyes the shade of a storm that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to kill you. He wore a midnight navy overcoat that had been cut by someone in Milan who understood the difference between fabric and armor. He smelled faintly of sandalwood and something darker underneath, like leather that had been rained on and then left to dry near a fire. His name was Luca Moretti, and there was not a single dock worker, judge, alderman, or federal prosecutor in the city of Chicago who did not lower their voice when they said it. He was 34 years old, and he had inherited the Moretti syndicate from his father at 26. And in the 8 years since, he had turned a regional operation into something that quietly controlled the Port of Chicago, the private security contracts for half the Fortune 500, headquartered in the Loop, 3 casinos in Indiana, and a shipping route that ran from Montreal down to New Orleans. He did not appear in newspapers. He did not attend galas. He moved through the city the way a shark moves through a reef, unseen until it wasn't, and by then it was already too late. The 2 other passengers in the car, a woman with a laundry bag and a man with earbuds, took one look at the men in suits and quietly stood up at the next stop and got off, even though it clearly wasn't theirs. Luca did not sit near Hazel. He took a seat 3 rows down on the opposite side of the aisle. He did not look at her. He was reading something on his phone, an encrypted message from his lieutenant in New Orleans, and his mind was on a shipment of counterfeit passports that had been intercepted at the border. He was not thinking about the exhausted young woman across the aisle. He was not thinking about anything except how many people he was going to have to make disappear before sunrise. Then the train lurched around the curve at Roosevelt, and Hazel, who had lost her fight with gravity somewhere between Harrison and Roosevelt, tipped sideways in her seat. Her body listed, her head fell, and by the time the train straightened, her cheek was resting on the shoulder of the man who had, at some point in the last 30 seconds, silently moved from his seat 3 rows down to the seat directly beside her. His bodyguards had not seen him move. Neither had she. He had moved the instant the flickering overhead light caught her face at just the right angle and revealed, above her left eyebrow, a small crescent-shaped scar the size of a fingernail. He had moved because he had been describing that exact scar to private investigators for 7 years. He did not breathe. For a full 10 seconds, Luca Moretti, a man who had once negotiated a hostage exchange while eating a bowl of pasta, did not breathe. His right arm, the one her head was resting on, went absolutely still. Her hair smelled like industrial lemon cleaner and cheap drugstore shampoo, and underneath that, faintly, like rain. His eyes traced her face slowly, cataloging every detail like a man reading a letter he had waited 7 years to receive. The scar above her eyebrow, the exhaustion smudged under her eyes like bruises, the chapped lips, the callus on the side of her right thumb from gripping a mop handle, the frayed cuff of her uniform where she had clearly tried to sew it back together with the wrong color thread, and in her apron pocket, half sticking out, a small notebook with a page corner turned down. He tilted his head just enough to read the top line without disturbing her. Grandma Nora, 6 a.m., blood pressure medication. Use the blue cup. Something in his chest, something he had been very sure was scar tissue, and nothing else, moved. Across the aisle, his second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Dominic with a shaved head and a Glock 19 tucked into a shoulder holster under his jacket, took one step forward, ready to peel the sleeping girl off his boss by the back of her collar. Luca did not turn his head. He simply raised the index finger of his left hand. One finger, half an inch. Dominic froze mid-step as if the temperature in the car had dropped 40 degrees. Luca spoke without moving his lips more than necessary, in a voice so quiet Dominic had to lean in to catch it. Nobody touches her. Nobody wakes her. Not until she is home safe. Dominic nodded once and stepped back. The other 2 bodyguards did not so much as glance in their direction. The train rolled on. For 23 minutes, Luca Moretti did not move. His arm went numb. He didn't shift. A tear, small and slow, slipped from the corner of Hazel's closed eye and disappeared into the wool of his overcoat. And he did not flinch. He watched her breathe. He watched the way her lips moved slightly, as if she were arguing with someone in her sleep. He watched her hand, small and reddened from bleach, curl instinctively into the fabric of his coat sleeve like a child holding on to a parent in a crowd. And Luca Moretti, who had put men in the trunks of cars for lesser familiarity, closed his eyes and let her hold on. Because 7 years ago, on a rain-slicked stretch of Sheridan Road just outside Evanston, a 19-year-old girl he had never seen before and never seen since had pulled his bleeding body out of an overturned Mercedes while it was still smoking. She had pressed a cream-colored wool scarf against the knife wound in his abdomen, the wound that had been carved into him 20 minutes earlier by a man he had trusted for a decade. She had whispered a prayer over him in a voice that shook but did not stop. And when he had opened his mouth dying to ask her name, she had only said, Hazel. And then she had seen the guns scattered in the wreckage, and the fear had entered her eyes, and she had run. He had woken up 3 days later in a private hospital in Lake Forest with her scarf still balled in his fist. Embroidered in the corner, in small careful stitches, were 2 letters. H.W. He had kept the scarf in a locked drawer of his desk for 7 years. He had folded it every night. He had never once let another woman touch it. The train hissed to a stop at 18th Street. Hazel's eyes snapped open. For a fraction of a second, she was disoriented, her cheek warm against something that was decidedly not the plastic backrest of a CTA seat, and then her nostrils registered sandalwood, and her eyes registered the very expensive wool of a very expensive coat, and her brain registered, with a special kind of horror reserved for exhausted women who fall asleep on strangers, that she had drooled. Not much, a little, on a coat that probably cost more than her rent for a year. She catapulted upright, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh my God, sir. I am so sorry. I have been on my feet for 18 hours. I did not mean to. I am so sorry. I am getting off. This is my stop. I am so sorry. He turned his head slowly to look at her, and for one strange, suspended second, she felt the entire train car shrink down to the space between his eyes and hers. He did not look angry. He did not look annoyed. He looked at her the way a man might look at a door he had been standing outside of for 7 winters, finally opening. He said, in a low voice that felt more like a vibration than a sound, "You have nothing to apologize for. You are the first person in 7 years who has ever owed me nothing." Hazel did not understand what that meant. She was already halfway out of her seat, cheeks burning, bag half slung, muttering another string of apologies. She stumbled off the train onto the platform, and only when the doors began to hiss shut did she look back. Through the closing glass, she saw the stranger sitting very still, one gloved hand pressed flat against the left side of his abdomen, exactly where a scar she could not possibly know about lived under his shirt. Their eyes met. Something in her chest, something that had been sleeping for 7 years, turned over once in its sleep. Then the doors closed, the train pulled away, and Hazel Whitmore walked home in the rain without an umbrella, having no idea that she had just, for the second time in her life, saved a man she would not remember saving. Inside the train car, Luca Moretti finally exhaled. Dominic sat down across from him, looking at his boss the way you look at a stranger wearing your father's face. "Boss," Dominic said carefully. Who was she? Luca did not answer for a long moment. He was staring at the empty seat beside him, at the faint indentation where her weight had been, at a single strand of chestnut hair that had come loose from her bun and now lay across the navy wool of his sleeve like a signature. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that Dominic had to lean in again. "She is the woman I have been looking for since I was 27 years old. I want a file on her by sunrise. Her name, her address, her grandmother's doctor, her sister's grave, every debt she owes, every landlord who has ever raised her rent, every person who has ever made her cry. I want to know the name of the woman she is afraid of at work, and I want to know it before I finish my coffee tomorrow morning." Dominic swallowed. "Boss, if anyone has heard her, do we—" Luca finally turned his head, and his gray eyes had gone the color of gunmetal in winter. "No," he said softly. "Not yet. First, we find out everything. Then, we take everything they have. And then only then do we remind them that in this city there are debts written in ink, and there are debts written in blood, and the woman who just fell asleep on my shoulder is owed both." The train rolled on into the dark, carrying a Mafia boss with a single chestnut hair on his sleeve and a decision already made. Somewhere south of it, a tired girl in a cleaning uniform was climbing 4 flights of stairs to a one-bedroom apartment where her grandmother was calling her by her dead sister's name. Neither of them knew yet that by this time tomorrow, Camille Ashford's world would be on fire, a $94,000 debt would be dust, and a scarf that had been folded in a locked drawer for 7 years was finally about to be unfolded. If your heart is pounding right now, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share the story with someone who has ever felt invisible in a room full of people. And tell me in the comments, have you ever done a small kindness for a stranger and wondered, years later, if they ever thought of you again? Because in part 2, Hazel is about to find out exactly how loudly one stranger has been thinking of her. And Camille Ashford is about to learn that the quiet girl she humiliated at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night had a guardian she never saw coming. Hazel woke at 5:45 the next morning to the sound of her grandmother humming in the kitchen. It was a good sign. On the bad mornings, Nora didn't hum. On the bad mornings, she sat by the window and asked when Emma was coming home from school. Hazel padded into the tiny kitchen in her socks, kissed the top of her grandmother's silver head, and pressed the blue cup into her hands with the first pill of the day. Nora looked up at her with a sudden, startling clarity that dementia sometimes gifts in the mornings before stealing it back by noon. "You look tired, baby," Nora said, patting Hazel's cheek. "Did you dream about your sister again?" Hazel smiled the way she always smiled at that question, which was to say, not really. "No, Grandma. I dreamed about a train." Nora hummed thoughtfully. "Trains are good. Trains take you somewhere." Hazel did not have the heart to tell her grandmother that trains, in her experience, only ever took her from one exhausting place to another. She kissed Nora again, pulled her uniform out of a dryer, and by 6:45 she was on the bus to Sterling and Vance, unaware that her employment there had already ended 11 hours before she arrived. She stepped off the elevator on the 47th floor at 7:22 a.m., and the first thing she noticed was that the receptionist would not look at her. The second thing she noticed was Camille Ashford standing near the coffee bar in a cream-colored pantsuit, arms crossed, chin lifted, and a small, satisfied smile playing at the corner of her mouth, as if she had already tasted the morning and found it seasoned perfectly to her liking. Gerald, the manager, appeared at Hazel's elbow with the trembling apology of a man about to do something he had been paid to do but did not want to do. "Hazel, honey," he said, and his use of the word honey told her everything before his next sentence did. "I need you to come with me to the conference room, and I need you to bring your bag." The interrogation, if you could call it that, lasted 17 minutes. Camille sat at the head of the glass conference table with two senior partners flanking her, and she explained, in a voice pitched for maximum sympathy, that a Mont Blanc Meisterstuck pen worth $1,200 had gone missing from her desk overnight. That Hazel had been the only person on the floor. That she was, quote, "so very sorry to have to ask this, but under the circumstances, and given Hazel's, quote, financial situation, they would need to search her bag." Hazel felt her face go hot, then cold, then hot again. She said nothing. She simply appended her canvas bag on the glass conference table in front of three lawyers, whose combined income exceeded the gross domestic product of small nations. Out spilled her cheap spiral notebook, her grandmother's pill bottle, the label worn soft from handling, a granola bar, a house key on a keychain shaped like a yellow tulip, and a small laminated photograph, cracked at one corner, of a 14-year-old girl in a hospital gown giving the camera a peace sign. Emma. The pen was not there. Of course it was not there. Camille sighed the sigh of a woman deeply disappointed by the moral failings of the lower classes. "Well," she said, "you probably already pawned it. Girls like you always do. Gerald, I think you know what needs to happen." Hazel walked out of Sterling and Vance at 7:51 a.m. with her final paycheck withheld pending investigation, her uniform in a plastic bag, and a security guard trailing her to the elevator, as if she were the danger and not the woman upstairs in the cream-colored suit. She made it 3 blocks before her knees gave out on a wet iron bench outside the Willis Tower. For the first time in 7 years, longer even, since the day Emma's monitor had gone flat, Hazel Whitmore put her face in her hands and cried. Not delicately, not decoratively. She cried the way exhausted women cry when a last thread finally snaps, with her whole chest and her whole throat and the whole aching architecture of a life that had asked her for too much for too long. She did not see the black Escalade idling at the curb across the street. She did not see the tinted rear window slide down an inch. She did not see the gray eyes watching her from inside it, or the hand inside a leather glove that curled slowly into a fist against a wool-covered thigh. Luca Moretti had received the file at 4:17 a.m. He had read it once at his desk, once again over espresso, and a third time standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse watching the sun come up over Lake Michigan. He knew, by 6:30, the color of the cup Nora Whitmore preferred her morning pills in. He knew, by 6:45, that Emma Whitmore was buried in a section of Rose Hill Cemetery where the grass was not properly maintained because Hazel could not afford the annual upkeep fee. He knew, by 7, the exact amount of Hazel's remaining medical debt to Northwestern, $94,218. And he knew, by 7:52, that a woman named Camille Ashford had just done something that Camille Ashford was going to regret for the rest of her natural life. Luca watched Hazel cry on that bench for exactly 90 seconds. Then he tapped the glass partition between himself and his driver and said quietly, "Take me to the office, and get me the majority ownership records for Sterling and Vance. I want to know who owns them before I finish my second coffee, and I want to own them before I finish my third." By 4 that afternoon, Hazel had walked from a loop to Pilsen because she could not bring herself to spend $3.25 on the bus when she no longer had a paycheck coming. Her feet were blistered. Her uniform was soaked. She climbed the 4 flights to her apartment, opened the door, and stopped dead in the doorway. Her grandmother was sitting at the kitchen table across from a man in a midnight navy overcoat. He was holding a chipped blue teacup with a delicacy that seemed almost obscene against the size of his hands. Grandma Nora looked up, lucid and delighted. "Hazel, darling," she said, "your young man came to visit. He is very polite. He says he owes you something important, and he brought me roses." Real ones. Not the grocery store kind. Hazel could not speak. She looked at Luca Moretti sitting in her kitchen, and Luca Moretti looked back at her, and slowly, without breaking eye contact, he set down the teacup and stood up. He was much taller than the memory of him on the train. He seemed to take up more space than the room could accommodate. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was the same low vibration from the night before. "Forgive the intrusion. Your grandmother invited me in. I did not have the heart to refuse her." Hazel found her voice, barely. "Grandma, Grandma, could you go and change into your blue cardigan? The one Emma made. I want to take a picture of you later." Nora, God bless her, took the hint and shuffled off toward her bedroom humming. The moment the bedroom door clicked shut, Hazel turned on Luca with the low, controlled fury of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "Who are you?" she whispered. "And what in God's name are you doing in my apartment?" Luca did not step toward her. He did not raise his voice. He reached into the inside pocket of his overcoat, and he withdrew a folded piece of fabric. It was a scarf, cream-colored wool, faded now, but clean, and folded with the precision of a man who had folded it 1,000 times. In the corner, in small careful stitches, were 2 initials. H.W. He set it on the kitchen table between them. Hazel stared at it. And then, without warning, her legs stopped working. She sat down hard on the linoleum floor of her own kitchen. Her hands began to shake. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." 7 years ago, Luca said quietly, kneeling down slowly across from her so that they were eye to eye. On Sheridan Road, in the rain, a 19-year-old girl pulled a bleeding stranger out of an overturned car. She pressed her scarf against a knife wound in his stomach. She whispered a prayer over him. When he asked her name, she said one word, "Hazel." Then she saw the guns and the wreckage, and she ran. He woke up in a private hospital in Lake Forest 3 days later with that scarf balled in his fist. He has been looking for her ever since. Hazel was crying now, silent tears sliding down her face. "I prayed for you for 7 years," she whispered. "I never knew if you lived. I never told anyone. I thought if I told anyone, whoever had hurt you would come looking for me. And I had Emma to take care of. I could not risk it. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." Luca reached out very slowly and pressed the back of his gloved knuckles against her wet cheek. It was the gentlest touch Hazel had received from a man in a decade. "You saved my life," he said. "And then you spent 7 years believing you might have failed. Hazel, look at me." She looked. "You did not fail. I lived. I built everything I have because a girl in the rain refused to let me die alone. And I have spent every single year of that life owing a debt to a woman whose face I could not forget." He stood up then, and he offered her his hand. She took it. He pulled her gently to her feet. "Your grandmother's care," he said quietly, "is handled from this moment, not as payment, as gratitude. There is a private facility on the North Shore, a room overlooking the lake, a nurse who plays Sinatra in the afternoons because your grandmother mentioned twice in 20 minutes that she loved him. She can stay there for the rest of her life, and it will not cost you a single dollar." Hazel opened her mouth. He held up one finger, just as he had on the train. "Your sister's grave," he continued, "will be moved this Friday to the private section of Rosehill. She will rest beside my own mother. She will never be forgotten again, and the grass will never be neglected. And the $94,000 you owe Northwestern will be gone by 9 a.m. tomorrow. Not a loan, a gift, from a man who owes you far more than that and always will." Hazel could barely speak. "And Camille," she whispered. "Camille Ashford." Luca's gray eyes went cold in a way that made the temperature of the kitchen drop by 10 degrees. "Camille Ashford," he said softly, "is my problem now, not yours. You will not think of her again. But tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., you will come with me to Sterling and Vance. Because there is something you are owed, and I intend for you to receive it in the exact room where she took it from you." At 8:58 the next morning, Hazel Whitmore stepped out of a black Bentley in front of the Willis Tower, wearing a charcoal gray wrap dress that had been delivered to her apartment at 7 a.m. with a handwritten note. "You do not need armor. You already are the armor. Wear this because it fits you, not because it hides you." She had let her chestnut hair down for the first time in years. Luca Moretti walked half a step behind her, not in front of her, which was in itself a kind of statement to anyone who understood how men like Luca walked through the world. When they stepped off the elevator on the 47th floor, the entire office of Sterling and Vance was standing in the main conference room. The senior partners, the junior partners, the paralegals, the receptionist who had refused to look at Hazel the morning before. And at the far end of the glass table, in her cream-colored suit and her red-soled shoes, Camille Ashford, whose face had gone the exact color of skimmed milk the moment she saw who was walking behind Hazel. "Good morning," Luca said pleasantly, and pleasant was the most terrifying register his voice possessed. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Luca Moretti. As of 6:15 this morning, a holding company I control acquired the controlling interest in this firm. The paperwork was signed at 7. Your managing partner is aware. I am here for one matter, and one matter only." He turned to the enormous flat screen mounted on the wall. A representative of his security team pressed a button on a remote, and lobby footage from 2 nights earlier began to play. Hazel emptying her bag on the conference table. Emma's photograph sliding out. Camille's small, "Please smile." The footage cut. New footage began. Camille, alone in her office at 11:43 the same night, opening her handbag and dropping a Mont Blanc Meisterstuck pen inside it before zipping it shut and reaching for her coat. The room was so silent Hazel could hear the second hand on the wall clock. "Miss Ashford," Luca said quietly, "you fabricated a theft accusation against a woman earning $14 an hour to care for a grandmother with dementia. You did this because you were bored. You did this because it entertained you. And you did this in a firm that I now own." Camille opened her mouth. Luca did not let her speak. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. "You are terminated for cause, effective immediately. Your non-compete will be enforced to its fullest extent in every jurisdiction I can reach, which is all of them. Your engagement to Senator Whitfield's son will end within 72 hours, because his family cannot afford association with a woman under federal scrutiny. And by lunchtime today, I assure you, she will be under federal scrutiny. Your condominium in Lincoln Park is mortgaged through First Midwest, an institution in which I hold a substantial minority interest, and I have already made a telephone call. Every firm in this city will receive a discreet communication before the end of business. You will not practice law in Chicago again. You will not practice law in Illinois again. If I am feeling generous by Christmas, perhaps you will practice law in a state that does not have a coastline." Camille was trembling. "You cannot," she whispered. "You cannot do this over a cleaning woman." Luca stepped forward once. Just once. "You spent your career learning how to destroy people with paperwork," he said softly. "I did it before breakfast. The difference between us, Miss Ashford, is that she deserved kindness. You did not." He turned to Hazel then, and his expression gentled by degrees that only she could see. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "is owed a formal apology, a full year of back pay at the market rate for the position of lead operations coordinator, which is the job she has actually been doing on this floor for 3 years without title or compensation, and a written letter of recommendation signed by every partner in this firm. It will be on my desk by 5 p.m. today." He turned back to the room. "Are we clear?" 22 lawyers nodded in unison. Not one of them looked at Camille. As Luca and Hazel walked out of the conference room, the receptionist who had refused to meet Hazel's eyes the day before stood up from her desk and quietly and without ceremony began to clap. Then a paralegal joined her. Then the mailroom clerk. By the time the elevator doors closed on Hazel and Luca, the entire 47th floor of Sterling and Vance was on its feet, applauding a cleaning woman none of them had ever bothered to say good morning to. If this is the part of the story where your chest feels a little too full, do me one favor before it ends. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who has ever been called invisible, and subscribe for more stories where the quiet ones finally get the ending they were owed all along. 6 weeks passed. Grandma Nora settled into her Lakeview room on the North Shore, and on the 3rd afternoon there, a young nurse named Beatrice put a Sinatra record on the turntable, and Nora wept with joy and called the nurse Emma, and Beatrice, who had been briefed, held her hand, and said, "Yes, Grandma, I am right here." Emma Whitmore's grave was moved on a bright Friday to a shaded plot beneath a maple tree, and Hazel planted yellow tulips around the new headstone with her own hands while Luca stood a respectful 10 feet behind her with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, holding the watering can like a man who had never held a watering can before, but was absolutely going to learn. Hazel re-enrolled at Loyola. She did not let Luca pay her tuition. She used the back pay from Sterling and Vance, and when that ran out in her second semester, she took a paid research position at a nursing foundation whose primary donor happened to be, coincidentally, a certain holding company headquartered in a glass tower on Wacker Drive, though the paperwork was buried carefully enough that Hazel did not find out for another 2 years. And by then she had stopped being angry about that kind of thing. On a Saturday evening in early October, exactly 7 years and 1 month after a girl in the rain had knelt beside a bleeding stranger, Luca Moretti took Hazel Whitmore to the rooftop garden of his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. String lights had been hung between the planters. A record was playing somewhere. She wore an emerald green dress that had been made for her body, not against it. She had let her chestnut hair down, and it fell past her shoulders in the way she had been afraid to let it fall for a decade. "You know," she said quietly, standing at the railing with a glass of wine untouched in her hand, "you have to stop this eventually. The debt was paid 7 years ago. It was paid the second I decided not to run before the ambulance came." Luca stepped up behind her, close but not touching, and rested his forearms on the railing beside hers. "The debt was paid then," he agreed. "Everything since has been something else." She turned her head. "What else?" He looked at her for a long moment, and the man who had once run half the shipping routes on the Great Lakes with a raised eyebrow, who had once ended a rival family with a single phone call from a hotel bathroom in Milan, who had lived his entire adult life carefully arranged behind glass, took the softest breath of his life and said, the slow, terrifying process of a man who was never supposed to love anything at all learning, one train ride at a time, that he loves you. Hazel did not say anything for a long time. Then she set down her wine glass, turned to face him fully, and reached up and put her palm flat against the left side of his abdomen, over the shirt, over the scar she had once pressed a cream-colored scarf against. His breath caught. She said, when I fell asleep on that train, I thought the worst thing that could happen was embarrassing myself in front of a stranger. He waited. She smiled, small and wet-eyed and finally not tired. Instead, she said, I woke up. He kissed her then, not the way men in his line of work kissed women, which was to say briefly and as a form of ownership, but slowly, the way a man kisses the answer to a prayer he did not know he had been praying for 7 years. Somewhere in the city below them, a Red Line train was pulling out of an empty station, carrying strangers home to lives they had not yet realized were about to change. Somewhere in a facility on the North Shore, an old woman was humming to a Sinatra record. Somewhere in Rose Hill Cemetery, a small headstone under a maple tree was surrounded by yellow tulips that would bloom every spring for the rest of Hazel Whitmore's life. And somewhere in a locked drawer that no longer needed to be locked, a folded cream-colored scarf sat quietly, its work at long last complete. Did Hazel Whitmore find love? Or did love finally find the woman who had spent 7 years believing she deserved nothing at all? Sometimes the universe repays kindness in ways we cannot imagine on the day we give it. Sometimes the bleeding stranger you kneel beside in the rain is the storm that will one day stand between you and every cruel thing this world has ever tried to do to you. If this story moved you, please hit that like button one more time. Share it with someone who has ever fallen asleep on a train too tired to hold their own head up. And subscribe so you never miss another story where the quiet ones are finally seen. And in the comments below, I want you to tell me honestly, would you have stayed with the bleeding stranger in the rain, or would you have run? Because somewhere out there right now, a stranger might be waiting 7 years to thank you for the smallest kindness you have already forgotten you ever did.